It's the year 2033 and America has crossed the line. After decades of global unipolar rule, after decades of foreign wars and economic extortion, Uncle Sam has finally done the unforgivable. McDonald's has been nationalized and every foreign franchise around the world has been shut down with not a single McNugget left behind. That, fellow citizens of the world, was a bridge too far, and the Americans must be stopped before this lunacy goes any further. Everyone's put aside their differences. The United Kingdom, China, the European Union, Russia, India, Iran, South Korea, North Korea, and every other military on Earth are in lockstep for the first time in history. America will be taken by force and put back in its place once and for all. But in a hypothetical situation such as this, what would happen to the United States of America? Many military experts consider the country, or at least its 48 contiguous states, to be uninvadable, even as the specter of an occupied America haunts the dreams of many politicians and ordinary US citizens. So, in today's Warographics analysis, we're going to dive into the practical feasibility of an invasion of the United States and form a final verdict on whether the American eagle could ever fall from the sky. Now, before we get into the meat of this analysis, we've got to establish one thing very clearly. Purely as a technicality, it is possible for the United States to be successfully invaded, at least on some level. One dude with a rowboat, a plastic knife, and no pants could definitely not do it. An army of 10 billion well-supplied, futuristic 28th century Navy SEAL cyborgs with lightsabers for hands could definitely do it. There is a threshold somewhere that's not really up for debate, but the question is, where is that threshold? And does any modern military have any hope of crossing it without the lightsabers for hands? Look, in order to achieve success, our global coalition will have to gain control of the continental United States, not part of it, but all of it. They'll have to neutralize American leadership in some way or another, deal with American military power, and most importantly, they can't just bombard America with nuclear weapons or even start a nuclear exchange. After all, if they did that, there would be no America left to invade, and the rest of the world would undoubtedly take a bit of a shellacking too. Instead, we're going to assume that the United States will not engage in a nuclear-first strike, but that if they're attacked with nuclear weapons, they will respond proportionally. The global coalition will have to invade without the use of strategic nuclear weapons, at least until they can neutralize America's ability to fire back. Now, before we get into our war games, it's important to note that foreign powers have attempted or planned to invade the United States before with varying levels of success. In the War of 1812, Britain tried its best to achieve an Empire Strikes Back moment across the eastern seaboard, capturing Washington, D.C. and burning down the US Capitol and the Executive Mansion, which today is called the White House. A few decades later, in the American Civil War, armies from both the Union and Confederacy waged war on each other's claimed soil, culminating in a Union march through the American Deep South that leveled several cities. At the end of the 19th century, Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered the plans be drawn up for an Imperial German invasion of the US, where thousands of soldiers would land on Cape Cod in Massachusetts and march on Boston, although for what it's worth, the writer of today's video is actually from Boston and wishes any invading force good luck. The Kaiser also planned to bombard Manhattan by sea, followed, we presume, by a march on New York. In the 20th century, Canada drew up war plans to invade the United States in response to fears about growing Austrian power after World War I. These plans included the use of so-called flying columns, small, independent, and highly mobile land units to take several cities in the state of Maine. And although both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II recognized that they were unlikely to be able to attack the United States without victories in the European and Pacific theaters, both countries considered strategic bombing and even biological warfare against the US. Japan did land troops directly on American territory during the war, but these were on some very, very remote Alaskan islands, a far cry from setting foot on the American mainland. Once the Cold War began, the promise of mutually assured destruction between the US and the Soviet Union ensured that neither side had to focus on a land invasion by the other, and although the attacks of September 11th, 2001 constitute an attack on American soil, that too is pretty far off an invasion. As such, history offers very little precedence on how an invasion of the United States might go, but it does indicate a fundamental reality that will come up again and again in this video. The fact that only two countries, Mexico and Canada, share a land border with the United States, and the only other large military that could even reach America by land, that of Brazil, is on an entirely separate continent. Every other relevant nation here is separated from the United States by an ocean border. We'll be diving deeper into the implication of that in just a moment, but for now, suffice to say that any amphibious invasion of the US requires either the immense resources of an oceanic passage or the cooperation of Mexico or Canada just to get to the continental US. But we've got a modern global coalition to bring to the table, and both the coalition and the United States will bring 21st century tools to bear in a way that history just can't account for. Both sides will be packing some serious heat. So let's take stock of the military power at play in this scenario, shall we? First up, the global coalition. Now, we're not going to spend too much time accounting for the military contributions of, say, St. Kitts and Nevis here, but instead we'll account for the real major military hardware that the world can bring to bear. Counting active, reserve, and paramilitary forces, the world can field well over 60 million troops across all military branches, although the quality of those troops obviously varies quite a lot. According to Flight Global, the world flies about 40,000 military aircraft when the United States is subtracted out, and although the metrics for how countries count their naval ships are all over the place, it's safe to say that they've got at least a few thousand ships of decent quality. According to military consultant Nicholas Drummond, the world's supply of tanks, sans the US numbers, is about 66,000. But just accounting for hardware only tells a small part of the story. A very high proportion of it is out of date or even obsolete, especially when compared to the military arsenal of the United States. So instead, we can focus in on the hardware that would really matter during an invasion. First up, naval power. Not counting the US, the world possesses 10 aircraft carriers of varying actual quality and 16 helicopter carriers, also of varying quality. 6 nations are known or believed to possess ballistic missile submarines, and the world, other than the US, has well over 300 submarines, although again, some are not super advanced. In the skies, the world has a large number of Soviet-era and modern heavy-lift aircraft critical for transporting troops and hardware, but only 2 other countries other than the US operate strategic bombers, Russia and China, which together can put together a fleet of roughly 1,500 long-range bomber craft. The world has a fairly limited range of advanced fighter aircraft, mostly leaning on the 210 or so Chinese J-20 fifth-generation fighters and export versions of the American-made F-35, but when we factor in 4th-generation fighters, those numbers skyrocket to at least several thousand, plus quite a few valuable attack helicopters. On the ground, there aren't actually that many modern tanks, heavy artillery pieces, or missile launchers in circulation, especially once the US is out of the equation, but the numbers still run into the several thousands. And then there's the United States, which is by far the most robust single military in the world. With over 1 million uniformed personnel, the US Army and Marines can put hundreds of thousands of soldiers in frontline combat with tens of thousands of rocket artillery, armored vehicles, self-propelled howitzers, and some 6,500 top-of-the-line main battle tanks. In the sky, the US Air Force, Navy, Army, and Marines combined to field over 10,000 aircraft, including nearly 1,000 fifth-generation fighters between the F-35 and F-22, a number that is expected to double in the coming years. This is in addition to less advanced fighters, attack helicopters, and serious heavy lifting capacity with well over 500 massive airlifter planes. The US also flies the most advanced drone fleet in the world and 60-odd advanced strategic bombers, plus 74 older B-52 bombers. The Navy sells 11 aircraft carriers, 9 helicopter carriers, well over 100 heavy combat ships, and 64 attack and ballistic missile submarines. With the battle lines drawn, we'll explore the battle itself, beginning with the reasons to believe that a global invasion of the United States would succeed. First, we'd be remiss not to start with basic maths. Put the entire US military across from the rest of the world's military in, say, a single pitched battle, and although both sides would obviously take extremely high losses, it's hard to see how the US wouldn't be overwhelmed against odds well over 30-1. With the rest of the world's advanced militaries all working together, an American defeat is by far the likelier option. Obviously, we're not discussing a single-pitched battle here, but it's important to note that the world, as it stands today, probably does have the capability to beat the US using conventional warfare under certain circumstances. Then there's the world's ability to bleed the US by economic measures. The US engages in hundreds of billions of dollars of trade each year, with imports including rare metals, semiconductor chips, and other vital technologies that enable the US's ability to fight a prolonged war. While this would certainly hurt the rest of the world too, the United States would have a very hard time preparing to resist an attack and would likely have an even worse time repairing or replacing advanced hardware once it was destroyed. Then there's the strategic vulnerability of Hawaii and Alaska, two American states that would almost definitely be taken with enough force, causing the loss of massive numbers of US military personnel along with their ships, aircraft, and bases. The US military also stations large numbers of forces overseas, all of whom would be encircled and probably captured if the entire world decided to turn against them. With these out of the way, as well as other US territorial holdings in the Pacific, the US military would be effectively trapped on the American mainland, and even America's aircraft carriers and stealth warplanes would become too vulnerable to risk offensive measures against Europe or Asia. Now combine this with the invasion launch points that make the most sense, America's land borders with Mexico and Canada. If the world can establish safe troop transfer routes to Alaska via the Bering Strait and to South America, potentially as far south as Patagonia, to eliminate the risks of American air raids, then they could take their time amassing troops and heavy equipment for a land war, marching down through Canada and up through Central America before making a two-pronged assault. Here, amphibious landings on vulnerable portions of America's two coasts could be feasible, especially with significant military power drawn away to focus on land invasions. And then we've got to talk about the American power grid, which even the US's own Department of Energy recognizes as being vulnerable to physical attacks and cyber warfare. The power grid itself is segmented into various regional distribution systems, which aren't joined together in any meaningful way, and any one of those systems is vulnerable to attack on control centers or substations. In fact, they're a frequent target for domestic extremists within the United States. Experts within the US have assessed that the use of an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, over some parts of the continental United States could conceivably wipe out the US electrical grid, along with water and wastewater systems, communications, and several other critical infrastructure sectors. The most likely method to launch an EMP attack would be to detonate a nuclear weapon at a high altitude over the central United States, but this sort of attack can be carried out also via specialized non-nuclear munitions. If successful, this sort of attack would send the US back into analog, and given the potential benefits, it stands to reason that the forces of the world might dedicate some serious air power in an all-out assault to make this happen. And if the US does lose its defenses in the Pacific and around the world, then the vast majority of American population centers would be vulnerable to aerial, coastal, or land attack. If the world's warships can operate with impunity in international waters, then raids on cities like Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, Miami, Boston, or Washington, D.C. become a much greater risk, and attack on any of those cities could result in mass casualties if they couldn't be evacuated in time. Cities like Seattle, San Diego, and Phoenix would be well within striking range from a land-based invading force. And with Canadian support, cities that would otherwise be protected by the Great Lakes instead become susceptible to attack. Not only could these attacks incur unbelievable civilian losses, but they could force American defenders to attempt to protect those urban areas in direct confrontation rather than retreating to the interior. And finally, there's the question of the American will to fight. Now, there are two fair and diametrically opposed views to take here, each of which are going to get some folks really fired up in the comment section. On the one hand, the long history of war fatigue among the American public has showed itself again and again in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, just to name a few recent examples. Combine that with the intense pain of economic isolation, a potential loss of technology on which the modern US is heavily dependent, and the impact of large-scale civilian casualties, and it's not inconceivable that the American public could be willing to capitulate before the bullets run out. But on the other hand, there are equally legitimate and often very forceful arguments to be made for the cultural importance of national defense and resistance to occupation in the American ethos, and in this case, Americans wouldn't be called upon to support a foreign intervention. They'd be protecting their homes, their families, their way of life, and you can just ask the people of Ukraine what lengths a person will go to in order to protect those things. So, now it's time to talk about the American defense, which according to most experts is more than enough to defeat the individual invading forces of modern adversarial nations, say for example China or Russia or Iran or all three put together. The calculus changes quite a bit when we include America's modern friendly nations as part of an invading force, not least because those international military bases we discussed earlier turn into a liability instead of an asset, and we can say with reasonable certainty that those bases would eventually be overrun, even if they were able to incur heavy casualties on the rest of the world before they went down. But then it's a question of actually attacking the US territories. Although we'll start with Alaska and Hawaii, the issue we'll identify here is even more important important when attacking the US mainland. Basically, any troops that can participate in an amphibious or land invasion will have to cross the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans to do it. That leaves them vulnerable for thousands of miles, prone to airstrikes from American air power or submarines, and well-armed transport ships are a rare commodity around the world. Just as one example, China's Yuuzhou-class amphibious transport ships can ferry 60 armored vehicles and 800 troops each, but China only has 9 of those, plus a few dozen landing ships that can carry less than a dozen armored vehicles and 350 or fewer troops each. And that's from one of the world's best equipped navies. Most naval forces around the world couldn't load more than a couple of thousand troops if they wanted to. In order to make up for the deficit, the nations of the world would likely have to requisition civilian vessels, cruise ships, cargo ships, things like that, in order to capture territory like Hawaii, Alaska, or isolated American bases around the world. Those lightly armored ships would be highly vulnerable to attack, especially from air-to-surface missiles that, say, American F-35s could launch from dozens of miles away while staying invisible to radar. Meanwhile, cargo planes are no good airlifting troops if there's nowhere for those troops to land, so they're functionally useless until troops can establish safe landing zones by other means. And then there's American naval and air power to deal with, which in addition to flaying troop transport vessels alive, could probably take down quite a few aircraft carriers, destroyers, and the like before they ever reached Alaska or Hawaii, and even more as they proceed toward the American continent. And lest you think that the strategy we mentioned earlier, amassing troops on South America and marching northward, might actually be useful, bear in mind that the United States would see these troop movements coming. These sorts of military buildups take serious time. Just see Russia's buildup on the border of Ukraine in early 2022, and American satellites would likely be watching the whole show. There are a number of ways that the US might react to this, but one way worth spotlighting is a preemptive invasion of Mexico. If the US were to preemptively claim this territory, they could force a bottleneck in Central America for any approaching land invasion force, and we feel relatively comfortable saying that American strategic bombers are more than capable of completing some devastating bombing runs over the Central American Isthmus. Most likely, this would force a stalemate for any forces coming from the south, especially with help from American warships in the Gulf of Mexico. And unlike most other countries on Earth, even those like the UK or Japan, which are separated by sea from their neighbors, America can hold out on its own territory and resources almost indefinitely. While the continental US doesn't have everything, it does have more than enough means to stabilize its own food production, manufacture conventional weapons and military hardware, and protect its heartland, especially if the power grid stays intact. And if the world can't launch strategic nuclear weapons in our scenario, then the deployment of an EMP weapon over the heartlands would be very difficult without first securing the coasts. Otherwise, the entire power of American air defense would be brought to bear over American territory in a sustained assault that an enemy air fleet would have to survive for some thousands of miles before reaching their target. Even if they do, they'll then need to maintain reliable supply lines, which is an incredibly difficult feat when it's being done across an entire ocean. But assuming all that falls apart, assuming Hawaii, Alaska, and Mexico fall under the control of an invading force and armies can mass on America's northern and southern borders, then there's the mainland, and that's a whole other can of worms. This probably shouldn't be a surprise, but we've got to say it anyway. Americans really like their guns, to the point where there are more firearms in America than there are people, and there's 330 million people. Hypothetically speaking, every man, woman, child, and baby in the United States could be assigned their own weapon, and although there's only so much that an untrained civilian can do in a war zone, that point becomes a lot less important when there's hundreds of millions of civilians in the war zone. Many Americans would be more than capable of taking up arms in defense of their country, especially the millions of military veterans, and if America were to mobilize for total war, it would have more than enough of a civilian workforce to sustain a truly massive war effort. And it's not just the American public that can help the US fend off an invasion, but America's unique geography as well. From high mountains to brutal deserts to wide plains to harsh below-freezing territory up north, America is a hell of a challenge to navigate or survive, and because of the specific way that American rural geography interacts with its politics, those hard-to-navigate regions are exactly where well-armed, well-stocked militias are likely to be the biggest problem, even before support floods in from the US military and other volunteer fighters who are willing to cooperate operate with these militias under the circumstances. Invading cities is no easy task either. Urban warfare is incredibly dangerous for an attacking force in the best of times, and invading, say, New York City should be a terrifying proposition. The American interior is also well equipped to facilitate rapid, efficient troop movements, thanks in no small part to Dwight D. Eisenhower's forethought in building the interstate highway system. The interstate system was designed in part to ensure that American troops can stay mobile all throughout the country, and the United States Department of Defense has mapped out a much larger strategic highway network. From the perspective of an invading force, the mountains, the deserts, and the rivers can all be lethal on their own. All of these factors, when taken together, make the continental United States ideal for a guerrilla defense. And when a guerrilla defense includes fifth-generation fighter jets and main battle tanks, it's got some pretty clear potential for success. The continental interior is vital to sustaining a war effort, not just because troops can pivot rapidly to defend various areas, but because any sort of prolonged massing of troops, or the long battle that would almost certainly take place before Alaska or Hawaii were to fall, would give American civilians plenty of time to evacuate their coastal cities and towns. Once in the heartland, they'll find themselves at the center of American manufacturing and food production, with the Rocky and Appalachian Mountains protecting the eastern and western flanks, and the Great Lakes in the arid American Southwest offering significant additional protection. Even in this worst-case scenario, American forces can operate freely within their coastal cities, relying on massive armed volunteer support to create battles of their choosing and continue a sustained land and air counterattack for months before ever having to move inward to more defensible positions. While none of these realities make an invasion of the United States technically impossible, they do make it incredibly difficult under the best of circumstances. The prospect of a global invasion of the US has quite a few points of potential failure. If US forces abroad are able to hold out, if Americans can hold Hawaii and Alaska, if a land invasion from Mexico or Canada isn't feasible, or if American cities can be evacuated in time, then a successful invasion becomes very, very difficult to achieve. On the other hand, the United States can force failure at any one of those points, or cause delays and protracted military exchanges for as long as they need to. In order to understand what an invasion might actually look like in practice, we can game out a few scenarios. Now, obviously, we're not qualified military strategists, so please take this with a lot of grains of salt and feel free to wargame out your own version of events in the comment section below. In the first scenario, we've got an amphibious invasion, one in which the American coasts are attacked by the forces of the Eastern Hemisphere, while forces stationed on the American supercontinent can attack by land. In this case, we anticipate that while Hawaii and most remote American military bases would eventually fall, they would first be used as forward staging areas for counterattacks to harass an invasion force. Many heavy troop transport ships and other major naval vessels would be lost in the attempt to take Hawaii, taking with them a number of elite troops and some of the best armored transport vessels at the cost of several American carriers and dozens of other American ships and strategic bombers. Once Hawaii is secured, the amphibious invading forces would have to spread themselves thin along the eastern and western seaboards in order to prevent the United States from concentrating overwhelming force at a more limited number of beachheads. But during this time, even more troop carriers would be lost, and despite attempts to land paratroopers and attack with naval support, we expect that very few amphibious attacks would be able to establish a beachhead with their limited number of soldiers. Those that did would be pushed back, and with so many transport ships destroyed, there would be only limited resources left to fight at sea or threaten second invasion attempts. Global naval forces would be forced to retreat against the combined onslaught of American naval and air counterattack, and on land, the Canadian military from the north and the combined forces of South America pushing up through Mexico would be beaten back fairly easily by a combination of active military and volunteer forces. So, score one for America. In the second scenario, we'll assume that Alaska falls to the forces of the world without much issue, and South America becomes a viable staging ground for an overland invasion. In this case, the United States is unable to project quite as much force to defend Hawaii, although submarines continue to sustain an assault against amphibious landing forces where they can. Due to the prospect of an overland invasion, global navies may establish a blockade or defensive perimeter around the United States, and although it would be difficult to hem in any submarines, surface vessels should be easy enough to contain. Ground troops mass in Canada and South America and move to attack the United States. During this time, the US is able to prevent troop landings in Mexico, rely on Texan and Californian bases in the Gulf of Mexico. In order to establish the bottleneck that we mentioned earlier, US troops surge into Mexico, pushing back a far smaller and less prepared Mexican military to at least Mexico City, and probably to the edge of the states of Veracruz and Oaxaca. There, they would be able to defend a narrow point of under 200 miles. The US may also attempt to secure Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula in order to preserve the Gulf of Mexico as a staging ground for aerial attacks. In this instance, we believe that a combined American naval, air, and ground force would be able to hold back invasion from the south, while amphibious forces wait to attack, leaving only an overland invasion from Canada as a possibility. Although Seattle, parts of New England, and even Chicago could conceivably be lost during this invasion, it's unlikely that these areas could be attacked before the US can evacuate civilians and organize a defense. With such a vast border to attack, it's likely that an attacking force would need to congregate into a few main attacking columns. Once they did, the US would likely be able to use guerrilla tactics aided by advanced warfighting equipment, and by the time that cities like Billings, Minneapolis, or New York came under threat, the invaders would probably be beaten back. If the invading force chose to use more asymmetric invading tactics, they'd be going head-to-head against an asymmetric American force, which would be defending its own lands with far more robust supply lines and greater manpower. So, the US is up on the scorecards, 2 wins to 0. In our final scenario, though, we'll just give our invading force their best possible chance to win, and see if they can get it done. In this case, the United States fails outright to defend Alaska and Hawaii, and they're basically unopposed in moving amphibious assault ships to the east and west coasts. The Americans will retain control over the Gulf of Mexico, at least at the outset, but enemy troops will be allowed to mass at the Mexican and Canadian borders. In this scenario, the US endures a withering first assault. Although the major American coastal cities are able to be evacuated in time, they're attacked in full force by as many troops as the world's enemy troop ships can land. While many of these cities can be defended, a few on each coast do eventually fall. Let's say San Francisco and Portland on the west coast, and Boston, Charleston, and Jacksonville on the east. This allows the global military to begin landing forces at major airports using strategic airlifters, and troops attacking by land are able to seize several major cities in the American Southwest, most importantly San Diego, despite taking severe losses in the process. In the south, Phoenix, San Antonio, and Houston fall, and northern New England and about 80 to 100 miles of territory move under enemy control as they move south from the Canadian border. By now, American forces have taken a proper shellacking. The land west of the Rocky Mountains, north of Billings, Montana, south of Albuquerque, and east of the Appalachians has been lost, and most major cities in those areas have been destroyed by urban battle. But this comes at a cost for the invaders. A large proportion of the initial attacking force has been wiped out, and though the Americans are distracted by preparations on their second line of defense, there aren't enough troops on the southern, eastern, or western fronts to pursue them to the interior. While the northern front has been spared most of the urban combat that everybody else received, they're now on their own to press an attack. Many of the world's troop transport ships and aircraft were undoubtedly lost during the first wave of amphibious landings, and this is where the American continent's advantage truly comes into play. Even if the northern and southern fronts are supplied by land, any force attacking from the coast must sustain supply lines across an entire ocean, and even before we consider harassment from American submarines, the task of sustaining those supply lines is already exceedingly difficult. Reinforcements and supply can't come quickly enough, and any attempts to move into the Rocky or Appalachian Mountains is quickly beaten back by American guerrilla fighters. American air power is advanced enough with enough planes in the sky to maintain their claim to the airspace over any territory the US controls, and though most US naval power has probably been lost, captured, or forced to flee, the American submarine fleet is still very much alive and well. And it's here that a first American counterattack might truly begin, first eradicating the invaders from the eastern seaboard, where it's been harder to establish a true foothold, and then from the Pacific coast, while the invading force from the south struggles to cross some extremely harsh desert and bioterrain. Those that can attack do so in a narrow stretch of land between Amarillo, Texas, and Shreveport, Louisiana, and are delayed, while the US can pivot most of its forces, including all of those battle tanks, to the northern front. As this is going on, American manufacturing and agriculture centers are continuing to meet the military supply needs, and once the coasts are taken back, the United States can pivot to the two remaining fronts. Before long, the Americans are able to attack from the flanks using the Gulf of Mexico to move against the southern attackers and the Rocky Mountains against the northern attack. American submarines can be resupplied via the coasts and work to prevent the attackers from being resupplied by sea, now stretching their logistical support lines thinner and thinner in the overland routes. Reinforcements for the attackers simply cannot come from half a world away, not faster than an American counterattack can defeat them, and despite cataclysmic losses on the American side, the enemy front will collapse before the American front does. America goes up 3-0 in the most Pyrrhic of Pyrrhic victories. Look, as we said before, this is just our take on the question, and please do note that, again, we're not experts in military strategy, we're just having a bit of fun. But even in the most favourable of favourable scenarios, putting aside nuclear weapons and America's strategic allies, and even conceding some US states, we consider it unlikely that any invading force that the world can muster would be able to overrun the American continent. Given all of these pesky real-world constraints, though, it seems unlikely that we're going to have to test this theory for a very, very long time. Thanks for watching.